earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
My name is Roy Tohms. I was with the Air Force. Well, I was subject to draft, and I worked in the War Department in Washington for a year, and there were 10 of us. We took different branches. Out of the 10 of us, I was the only one that passed the physicals, and was elected to go to the Air Force. So I signed up, and they didn't have a place to go for training, so I went back to work, and I worked for 6 months. And then from there, they reshipped us to different places, and I went to California. And that's where I started my training as a cadet in California. There were accidents, and there were, the fact is, you had groups together. We did anyway. And about 4 or 5 of us, we would spend the night, evening, talking over what the instructor had told us, asking, is that right? Is that what we're going to have? And we would argue back and forth, and finally we'd say, we'll check it out tomorrow. So the next day we would take an airplane and go out and check and see what really happened. Some could do it, some couldn't do it. Some, you find out that every person has their own ability and their own ideas. And you have to work it together to get the job done. And I had the reputation you don't know when to quit. And then from California, from pre-flight to basic to advanced in Arizona, where I graduated and was given a lieutenant's rank. And from there, I went to Florida and went to fighters, P-40 fighters training down in Sarasota. And when that was finished, they were looking for candidates for a new school, aviation reconnaissance, something new that had just taken place. The British had started down in Africa, and it was with P-51, which was the latest aircraft. So I went through that school down in Meridian, Mississippi. And it was a very informative type school. We had to go to different branches and work with each of the different branches to see what they did and how they did it. And we visited them and spent a week in infantry, spent a week in artillery, spent a week in armor. I learned how to drive a tank and how to shoot a gun. And because in our practice, we did work with each of these units. And the generals would call up and want to know what was going on ahead of their unit. And we would have to fly out there and either take pictures and tell them what they wanted to know. It was a very interesting type of job, and I learned a good bit. I learned how to control different people, how to analyze different people. You had different ideas, and my object was to do the job, do it now, and do it right. And I found out that that's impossible because some people just aren't in the right bracket. They're misdirected and they have the wrong ideas. So you have to analyze each person and I got sent overseas in beginning of the European invasion. I was a filler, losses on D-Day. So I was with the unit in England when D-Day took place. And my instructor had fulfilled his number of missions and was ready to go home. So I was the party that he picked on to take over his job. And I came in as a new recruit and had in charge of 10 pilots. And that is one of the toughest jobs I could imagine because they're hard to control. And I learned a good bit. I found out how to do different things and had friends that helped. So we would consider what happened and why it happened and how to take care of it and do certain things. And it was an interesting job. Well, in the war, I was in 44 and 45. That would be 2 years of combat. And then I came home and I had some interesting experiences, though. One was in New Year's or Christmas, 44. We couldn't fly because the weather was so bad. And the day after Christmas, the weather broke, and I was interested in going out, so I was one of the first ones out. And I flew out over the front lines and found a whole group of tanks parked on the road early in the morning. And they were empty or vacant. I flew around and I called back for help. We were supplied with supplies whenever we needed help. So I told them what I found, and they were saying, we'll send you help right out. So I circled about twice around this group of tanks, about 25 of them. And 4 P-38s came out. And we greeted each other by wiggling our wings. And they followed me, and I led them down. I thought they had bombs on. And they bombed these tanks, but they weren't bombs. They were 150-gallon napalm gas tanks. And when the tank fell, it fanned out over the tanks with a sheet of fire. And they 4 of them covered all those tanks with this napalm gasoline. And that was the job of that. So I went down the road because I wondered where the men were. So I went down the road a couple of miles, and there on the hillside was a whole bunch of people having breakfast. And so I circled around and called for more help. And they said they'd send it right out. So I went back over on the west side. There was a ridge of mountains there. And the 4 P-47s came in. They're a radial engine fighter plane with 8 machine guns on. And as I was meeting with them, I looked down and there was a fellow shooting at me, a rifle. And I thought, well, that can't be. I'll take care of him. So I went down and shot at him. And when I shot, I had 650 calibers, and he disappeared. So I pulled up to get back in to lead the 47s in. And I looked at my tail, and there was machine gun bullets right at my tail. And I thought, oh, I made a mistake. There was a machine gun nest there that he was shooting from. That was a mistake. And when I was thinking, I bought it now, I heard over the radio, said, my God, look at the number of people down here. So the 47 had followed me, and he'd gone over the mountain and hit this plane and right down over where all these fellows were eating. And he was as surprised as I was, because he didn't expect to see what that was. But anyway, I pulled up and went around to see what they were doing. They had the target put out for them so that they could I left that and went back over where the tanks were, and there was a black cloud up above them that they had been burned and so on. And it sort of smelled like a barbecue. So it had left some inhabitants for the tank. But anyway, from there I went on home. I was 22 then. Field, Arizona, for advanced training. Right off the bat, the instructor and I didn't get along. I did something wrong. I got off the wing of the airplane because the exhaust was burning my leg, and that upset him. And I was going to try some solution to that, but I didn't have to. The next day, he took a fighter plane out and he spun in. So we didn't have an instructor for 5 of us. And the major came down from headquarters and he appointed each of the other 4 men to the instructors that were there, 4 instructors. And he told me that I wouldn't have an instructor, that I could pick one for the day and he would come down and we'd go fly instruments. I would be an instrument guinea pig. And so that's how I went through advanced training. He had this plane fixed with a hood on it that I'd sit in the front seat. And he would shut the hood and I'd be on instruments. So I had to be ready any second to switch over, like from going into a cloud. You had to pick up your instruments right away. And we had some interesting experiences there too. We did a slow roll. We got upside down. He shut the hood. Well, that upset me. I didn't know what to do upside down. So I did a half split. And then say, pull the rudder back, or pull the stick back and push the rudder in. It does a quick flip. Well, we ended up on the level and he was white as a sheet. He says, "You can't do that. Plane won't take it." Well, he got over that, and later on he tried the same thing again, and I did it again. He said, "Well, I was wrong," but he was still scared. He is scared pretty well.
Oh my goodness.
Because it wasn't a good idea, but it worked. So that's one of the things that you learn. Sometimes it'll work, and sometimes it won't. We were up in Belgium, and the weather was bad, and General Patton came up and asked us to go out and find these tanks. He lined us up in a line, and he went down each one. "Will you go out and find my tanks?" And I said, "No, sir, can't fly." And that was because I just knew at the job, and that was a mistake. So he was very unhappy with the whole thing, and the weather was bad. But later on, I thought that was a stupid thing to say. I said, "Yes, sir, I will, if you go with me." And then he'd say, "Well, why?" So I need the weather cleared up. And that would have solved our problem. But, you meet different people, and Eisenhower came up. He wanted to fly with us one mission to see how things were. And people from the War Department, the Pentagon, would come over and ask us different things. And one of our early missions that I went out with my leader, he would take me with him to show me how to handle the mission, so that I would know what to do when I get put in job. We had a P-51 went up into the sun, and that's the wrong place to be. And I kept watching him, and pretty soon he came down, and I called to the leader. I said, "They're being attacked." break. And so he broke, and the guy went on down. And I couldn't imagine what the guy would be playing around with us. So we went back up into formation again, and I was a wingman that protected him. I didn't have a job, but that he would do the job, and I was watching. Pretty soon the guy came again. And the next time I thought, well, I'll take care of this. So when he started going down, I said, well, break right, break right. He did, and the guy went to follow him, but I went to get behind him. And then he broke off and he went down, and I went down after him. I was going to shoot. And my instructor knew what was going on, but I didn't. But he called me and he come back. Roy, come back, come back. So I broke off and came back. So after we landed, he said that guy was testing out our formation to see if we could protect each other. I said, he was lucky he got away with it. That's the way life is. I was in A flight, and my buddy was in B flight. And I had a friend that was in liaison. He did small airplane reconnaissance, like or take messages and do things like that. And our backgrounds would sometimes mesh. I like to ride on motorcycles and do jobs a certain way. And my buddy was from California, and he was in a dance bands, and he'd been experimenting with drugs, and yet he was a good fellow to be buddies with. He drank, but I didn't drink, so we got along pretty well that way. I could guide us home, and when we left France, the Germans pulled out of Versailles. We were based at Versailles. They pulled out and they left 2 motorcycles and a staff car. And this liaison pilot asked me if we'd like to have a motorcycle. And I said, yeah. He said, okay, we'll go down to Paris and we can have them. So we got an airplane and took us down to Paris, and we got these 2-cycle German motorcycles, and he got the staff car and drove it back up to Berlin, or up to
Versailles,
Belgium, or Gosselies, Belgium. This was slightly below where Napoleon had gotten stuck with his cannon and lost the war. Well, anyway, the motorcycle was a 2-cycle, and you had to mix oil with the gasoline to run it. And my mechanic and I got along real well. So he fixed a windscreen over the front, and he put aluminum things down at my feet to keep the water from splashing on my pants. And he took real good care of it. So one thing you learn is to get friends in the right places, because that'll help you survive. When this mechanic came back out of the field one time, having been beat up by a couple of truck drivers in town, I got in the Jeep and we went back to town, and I told the truck drivers not to come back to this place again. They understood what I meant. And the MPs were there, and they took them away from me and told me I'd to leave. But my mechanic from that point on made sure my airplane was in good shape. I had no problems with my airplane from that on. I guess the best thing would be to be a Bible reader and a believer in the Bible. that that's the answer to your problem. You have to have confidence in what you do and faith in it, in your leadership to do the right thing. No, I didn't get to Korea, but I was called up. I was called up again to fill in for the West Virginia Armored Cavalry. That was the third time when Vietnam opened up, and they needed pilots on the West Virginia Army Cavalry. So we went to Bowling Green, Maryland, and I flew helicopters that period of time. The second time I was called up was National Guard for Korea, and we went to Indianapolis and trained recruits to go to Korea. And instead of us going down to Korea, they were sent back to Germany to keep Russia from absorbing the western part of Germany. So I was over there for a year. And the Germans were a lot different at that period of time. They were friendly, and I had grown up in a German background, so I understood the language pretty well. And so we had from New Year's to Lent was the Fasching season. There was a party every night, if you could stand it. And then when Lent came up, they had a party that went to the Rhine River, and you washed your billfold out because it was empty. And then Lent took over. I did get hit once, and bloodshot eyelid. The plexiglass from my cockpit covering got into my eye, and I came back home. And the flight surgeon was in a poker game, and he had a pretty good hand, so he told me to wait. And I didn't wait. I got on my motorcycle, went down to the hospital, which was a couple miles down the road. And on the way, the wind washed it out, so I realized I didn't need to go to a doctor, but I had a bloodshot eye, which would give me a Purple Heart if I'd have gone in. But I wasn't worried about that.
Did you keep any close contact with any of your fellow soldiers in the military?
I did for a number of years, but for the last 20 years, they've all been gone. I don't have anybody left. We used to meet in Minneapolis every fall for the unit overseas, but they kept dying off. And
how did that affect you?
They're all gone. I should be there. I'm not. We had a good time in Russia. Mm-hmm. We stayed in the KGB barracks in different cities and took pictures. And that was something that was foreign to them. We had a lot of caviar that they'd be giving us. We didn't have a sales slip for it, so they confiscated it with the export. So the bodyguard, I told him, you take it, you keep it, we'll be back in a year or so. It never did go bad. But you see a lot of different interesting things traveling. India, we covered all of India. And saw how they lived and how the people work, take leaves, take tea leaves and drag them along in a bag, and how they wash clothing and lay it out on the grass to dry. live altogether differently than what we did. We ended up in a courtyard, and that was ended up to be a cemetery, and they had grills, about six grills, and a funeral came down the road. The woman, some man had died. They were yelling and screaming and praying, and they came in where we were, and they went around this place, and they placed the coffin on top of that, and then one priest or whatever lit the fire, and they burned the carcass, and then they scraped up the ashes, put it in a container, and they took it out to the river, and he went down the river with it. So we went through one of their rituals. They live a whole different life than we do. We had P-51s, and they would fly. Women would fly them over to England, and then they would take the engine out and put in a Rolls-Royce engine. And then they would call us, and we would fly up to England and get the plane and bring it back to our airport. So our airplanes were top of the line. And the three generals were always calling and wanting to know information for their units. Patton and Bradley and Hodges generals. And they liked to know what their questions were, and answered. So we did a good job for them. They liked it. Patton was happy when we did find these tanks. He set up a truckload of champagne. A truckload of champagne. We had champagne stacked up to the second floor.
And you didn't drink, huh?
I brought one home. He caught all kinds of trouble for it, too. And two brother-in-laws that were preachers that liked drinking. But when you're living in a country like France, that's their normal. They live differently than we do. I got into trouble with that airplane too. When I was out flying, we had to take and give all of our people a ride in an airplane for an experience. And one of the sergeants came up to me and brought this corporal up. He said he's a rebel and he thinks you can't do anything, it'll scare him. I said, oh, he's got to be crazy. Oh, he says, take him up and scare him. So I took him up in an airplane and did a spin or two, and then went up into the clouds and did another spin. He came down, it was all right. Except when I opened the cockpit and got out, he got sick. And I hadn't noticed it. Well, after I got out of the service, I flew for the guards, and I picked up a plane up in Pittsburgh and fly it up to the hill up here and laid up on the yard up there. And then when I was in the service with helicopters, I brought one back from Baltimore and landed up in the yard and took Susan and her mother up.
Where did you meet your wife?
In Washington. She was from Slippery Rock.
Oh.
She worked in the War Department too. And we got together and we're going together. And when I got sent out to California, so when I passed my first flying test, we decided to get married. So we got married. She followed me around different fields that I went to.
How long were you married?
75 years.
Oh.
Our boy was born just after I left for Europe. He was born in end of June, and I was there middle of June. So I didn't meet him until a year and a half later.
Was it hard leaving her to go to war?
Yeah. Well, when you get called up in the service, you're where to go, you go.